All right, guys, I'm going to attempt to record notes a little bit different than how I've done in the past. So just bear with me as I use these buttons on this new program. In this unit, we're going to be talking about ecology, and ecology is basically studying the organisms around us. So we're going to study the interactions that take place. So we're studying the interactions that take place between organisms and their environment. And there's kind of two parts to the environment. We have what we can call the abiotic parts and the biotic parts of the environment. And I'll define those for you here in just a little bit. But note that you're going to see several questions that contain graphs that might look like this. And so it looks like we have a population and we see it changing over time. You should be able to look at those population changes over time and have an explanation as to here, like why is the population increasing during this period of time? What is causing this population now to go down during this period of time? So these factors that can affect population sizes are listed down here below. And you should be able to figure out what is happening during certain periods of time, like in relation to predators or relation to pollution or diseases, because these are the factors that can affect whether populations are going up and also whether they are coming down. So, taking a look down here at the bottom, we say that these factors can be classified as abiotic factors. Now, A means like anti, bio means life. So, abiotic means non living. So there's non-living parts of the environment that can affect populations. And then we have the biotic factors, which means living. Now, instead of writing which of these factors up here are non-living and which one are living, because obviously I can't write very well with this pen, let's just go up here and we'll put an A for abiotic or a B for biotic next to these limiting factors, again, or factors that can influence population size of an organism. Now, when you think about this, you might consider, can I kill it? If you can kill it, then it is a biotic factor. If it's something that can't be killed, then it's going to be considered an abiotic factor. So, soil quality. We can't really kill soil because it's made of minerals. So we're going to consider this an abiotic factor. So it's not anything that is living that you can actually kill. As for the amount of food, all of our food comes from living organisms. So food would be considered a biotic factor. Competitors. Competitors can take away resources from other organisms. And so those would be considered limiting factors that would be biotic. Rainfall, you can't kill rain or the amount of rain, abiotic. Other species that maybe are assisting in a species, of course, they can die, so those are biotic. Predators, biotic. You can't kill pollution. So, for example, like when we talk about oil spills or air pollution, those molecules that are causing the pollution cannot be killed. So, those are going to be abiotic. Natural disasters, fire is not alive, neither are volcanoes, those are abiotic. Habitat size. Now, we can't necessarily kill um, the size of a habitat. Or if you think about it, like a mole's habitat would be underground. You can destroy it, but it's not something that you can kill. So it's going to be considered abiotic. Same with temperature and disease. Disease is caused by microorganisms that we can kill. So disease is considered a biotic factor. And when we come back up here to this graph, you should be able to discuss factors from this list and tell me how they would relate to the change that's happening during this time. So if I say relate an abiotic factor to what is happening at time X, well, you can see at times X, the population is increasing. So if you indicate a biotic factor like the amount of predators, you would say at time X, there is few predators in the area. So this population is able to increase during that time. There's also less disease. If I say indicate an abiotic factor that could be affecting this population at time X, then you could say temperature. So it looks like temperature is likely increasing because usually the warmer it is, then the more organisms are able to find resources, food, etc., because there's more foliage, there's more places to hide, etc. So I would say that at this time, there's probably warmer temperatures instead of cooler temperatures, because then you would get an increase instead of a decrease due to cooler temperatures. All right, moving on to the next page here. So we're going to look at how the environment affects other organisms. And then we're also going to look at how other organisms affect other organisms. So we're going to take a look at relationships that occur between living organisms. There are three types of relationships. Let's indicate three right here. There's three types of relationships that can affect population size. We have predator prey, we have competitive relationships, and then we have what is called symbiotic relationships, and we can sometimes call them symbiotic or cooperative relationships. Again, you need to be able to look at graphs and be able to draw conclusions about what is happening to populations here. Make sure you pay attention to your axis. So we need to have those well labeled. So this is days. And then over here, this is an indication of population size. Okay. Now, it says, what is causing the rabbit population to drop around day 6? So let's find where day 6 is. So these are the days down here. 6 would be right here. And you can see that around day 6, our population peaks and then it's going to start to drop. Now, when you study this chart, you can see right here that we have a predator-prey relationship taking place. And at this time, day 6, there is a high population of fox. And so that would be causing that rabbit population most likely to decrease. So we can say that the rabbit population is decreasing because of an increased population. So I'm going to abbreviate, increased population of fox eating the rabbits. Why is the fox population increasing around day 21? So again, days 21 is right here. And you can see that that fox population is going up here. Well, at that same time, we have a really high number of rabbits. So those fox have had an increase in their food supply, and that's why their population is able to increase at a high rate. All right, so predator-prey relationships, those are pretty easy to understand. The predator kills the prey. And usually we see population growth happen with these patterns. Populations go up and then they come back down. Populations go up and come back down. The predator population changes, usually they're low to start, but after that prey population goes up, then we start to see the predator population goes up. But eventually it starts to decrease because they are limiting their food as they continue to prey upon it. All right, next type of relationship is competitive relationship. And so if you and someone else are competing for the same thing, then that means that you're basically going for the same resources. Maybe you're competing to park your car, you're going for the same spot. So that is a competitive relationship. Now, before we talk about more about competitive relationships, you need to make sure you understand what the term niche means. Because when we talk about organisms have their own niche, which basically means that in an ecosystem, they have their job that they're supposed to do. And if they're not doing that job, as in eating certain things or being food for certain organisms, and then we can see that an ecosystem can become very unstable if organisms aren't there to do their job in that ecosystem. So, for example, earthworms. The job of an earthworm is to digest organic material in the soil. And then when they create waste, that's actually fertilizers for the plants growing in that area. So that's the job of an earthworm, is to fertilize the soil for other organisms. So if you're trying to figure out what a job is, think about what would happen if an organism completely disappeared in an area. So let's think about it. What would happen if frogs went extinct? Well, the job of frogs is to control populations of insects. And so these populations of insects would go up, and because it's the job of the frogs to control them. Okay, so that would be describing a frog's niche is to eat insects along around bodies of water in an ecosystem. Now, competition gets more severe as resources become more scarce. So if you think about it, if there's plenty of food, there's very little competition because there's enough to go around. But imagine if you haven't eaten for 3 days and I drop a pizza in the middle of your classroom. You can see there's going to be a lot of competition for those very limited slices of pizza. Okay, so we see a higher degree of competition whenever resources become more scarce or more limited. Now, in normal ecosystems, we don't see a lot of competition because organisms have their own role or they have their own niche, they have their own job. So, for example, we know that bats and frogs both eat insects. So, do they have the same niche? Do they have the same job? Not quite, because if you think about it, bats will hunt more at night and they're flying through the air and they're going to grab insects that are flying through the air. Whereas your frogs are now good, are more around these watery environments. They're limited to being around bodies of water, and they're going to eat insects that are more on the ground level. So it's kind of like they divided the resources. So the bats are taking the insects at night that are flying up in the air, and the frogs are eating the insects closer to the water level. They're in two different niches. Okay, they're controlling populations that live in two different areas as that ecosystem. Even something like two spiders, they can be living near one another. So this could be a spider that's in my garden shed, and then right out the door, this is a garden spider that's in my garden. Do they have the same job? No, they don't. They both eat insects, and so they control insect populations. They also serve as food sources for other organisms. But if you think about it, this one is eating the insects that are inside of a building because we rarely find them outside. And then these are the ones that are taking care of the insects by building webs and trapping them. A brown recluse doesn't even build a web to trap its prey, and actually is just able to pounce on them. So they have their own unique roles. They do not occupy the same niche. Now, where we do see a lot of competition when two organisms trying to occupy the same niche, and that can happen whenever we bring in another species that is not native in an environment. So competition happens frequently between native species and species that are introduced into that habitat. So, for example, we've talked a little bit about some introduced species. So, in Australia, we talked about rabbits. Remember, about 20 rabbits were brought in and released, and then the millions of rabbits that have resulted from those initial 20 have caused a lot of damage to the ecosystem. They destroy vegetation, so it's harder for other native organisms to find enough food, and they just can simply outpopulate those native species. We talked about those Bradford pear trees here in Missouri. So I'm just going to write Bradford pears. It's another example of an introduced or non-native species here in Missouri, and they are outcompeting our native trees. Now, the reason why these introduced species can outcompete the native species is usually due to a few reasons. So first, with these rabbits in Australia or with the cane toads in Australia, is they usually have adaptations that help them better survive in their environment. So one, take a look at the size of this cane toad. Anything that is small enough to fit in its mouth, it'll try to consume. So cane toads will eat basically any organism that will fit in its mouth. So everything from birds to small mammals to other frogs. And they are driving native species to extinction by either outcompeting them for food or actually using them as a food source. So native species have this new predator that they didn't have before the introduction of the cane toads. Now, something about the cane toads, what also gives them advantage against the native toads, is that they produce a toxin that will kill any predator that attempts to eat them. So, as you can tell, these cane toads have an advantage. First of all, there's nothing in Australia that can eat them. They have no natural predators there because nothing has evolved the ability to withstand the toxins that they produce. So, if a native species eats a cane toad, it doesn't have long before the toxin starts to take effect and it would kill them. Also, they have better adaptations. So remember, they're much bigger. So they have the ability to eat a lot of other food sources that those smaller native toads wouldn't be able to eat. So they have better adaptations that help them survive better. in that environment. And then also, they can reproduce at a faster rate than the native ones. So lots of times your introduced species have very large reproductive capabilities. Whenever you take a look at the eggs that are laid by a cane toad, they can lay almost 4 times the amount of eggs as a native toad that lives in Australia. So you can see that it's much easier for the cane toad population to overpopulate those native toad populations. And ultimately, one will go extinct. All right. So, again, just to kind of summarize the 3 types of relationships here, we have our predator prey. So, one is consuming the other one for energy. Competitive, they're after the same resources. And one, if they're in competition, there's limited resources, one can drive the other one to extinction. And then the third one is what we call these symbiotic relationships. So, in a symbiotic relationship, we have a close and permanent relationship. Now, what we mean by that is these two species in this relationship must um, exist together. One cannot exist without the other. So, for example, a human and dog would not be a symbiotic relationship because humans can live without dogs and dogs can live without humans. Okay. But an example of one would be the acacia ants and the acacia tree. This is an example of a symbiotic relationship. So, the only place that acacia ants live are on the acacia tree. The acacia tree is their food source and it's also where they build their homes. The acacia tree cannot survive and reproduce without the acacia ants. So, where you find one, you always find the other. It's a permanent relationship. Now, we would consider this to be what's called a symbiotic relationship called mutualism. And in mutualism, both of the species benefit from the relationship. Okay, so the ants are getting the home, and then the acacia tree are getting pollinated. And also, if there's any surrounding foliage from other organisms that start to crowd in through around that tree, the acacia ants will trim off any limbs and leaves of other plant species that are starting to crowd in around their tree. So it gives the tree additional resources because of these acacia ants. Also, if something tries to eat the acacia tree, then the acacia ants will protect the tree and will attack what is trying to eat the tree. So you can see they both benefit from this relationship. They both get something out of it. Another example would be bees and flowers. So bees must have flowers for their nectar. And at the same time, the flowers, those plants, are getting pollinated and then they're able to reproduce. So they both benefit from that relationship. Bees must have flowers. And if you want plants and flowering plants, you have to have bees to pollinate them for us to continue to get generations of flowering plants. A second example of a symbiotic relationship you probably heard of would be parasitism. And in parasitism, you have one benefits, and that's going to be the parasite, and the other is harmed. The one that is harmed is considered the host. So if we have a mammal that has a tapeworm, the mammal would be the host, and the tapeworm is going to be the parasite. This isn't considered predator prey, even though that tapeworm technically is feeding off of the molecules in the host. It's not considered predator prey because usually the host does not die when it's a parasitic relationship. So a tick doesn't usually kill its host, it just feeds off of it for a continued period of time. Same with the tapeworm. A tapeworm will live a very long time in its host, taking nutrients, and it usually doesn't kill the host. Now eventually it can, but if you think about it, the best parasites are the ones that do not kill their host, because if the host dies, then the parasite's going to die. So if a mammal has a tapeworm and the mammal dies, then the tapeworm is going to die as well. All right, the last one is commensalism. And commensalism, we have one species out of the two is going to benefit. And the only thing to put next or last here, because we have both benefit, one benefits, the other one's harmed. In this case, one benefits and the other is not affected. So basically, one organism just goes about commencing with its daily task and another organism benefits from the activities of this other organism. So, an example of a commensalistic relationship would be with the face mites that live on your skin, and they live around hair follicles, and they just eat the oil that you produce. Remember, you produce a wax, which is called sebum. And so they're just consuming all some of this extra wax here. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't help you. And there's pretty much no way to get rid of them. So wherever you have, humans, they are always going to be carrying these face mites. So that's an example of commensalism. One benefits, and so these face mites are getting a place to live and they're getting food, but the host, in this case, the human, isn't being affected. They're not being hurt, and they are not being harmed by that interaction. All right, moving on here to move this back here. This next page, almost done. So we're looking at things that can affect population sizes. So there's again the abiotic and biotic factors that can affect populations of organisms. And whenever we see population changes over time, whenever we see a population is in an area, usually its population goes up pretty quickly at the beginning, but eventually it's going to level off. And we see the population size go up and go down around a number. Now, this number is called the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity. You've probably seen a sign that says like capacity or carrying capacity. And what that means is that's the maximum number that can be in that area and be supported by that area during that period of time. So it looks like our carrying capacity here for this population was around 1.6 million, because this line right here, we can see the population goes up and down pretty much around that number. So populations will reach a carrying capacity and then they fluctuate around that carrying capacity. Now, this growth that we see happen before, as the population continues to climb and climb and climb over time, this is called exponential, because the population is going up and it's going up quickly. And exponents can cause number values to increase very quickly. So it's called exponential growth. So we see exponential growth happen until the population reaches its carrying capacity. Now, as a population gets near to that carrying capacity and it overshoots it, you can see that life becomes very difficult for some. And we see that the death rate goes up, and that's why the population is starting to fall. So whenever we overshoot that carrying capacity, that means that there might be more disease in the area. It might be hard to find resources, so organisms are starving. There might be more predators in the area because they've noticed that they have a large food supply in that area and they've moved in to consume them. So life is not good in a population in which that has reached carrying capacity.